There is a man of 35 lying in bed burning with fever. In those final days, it was said he believed he was being poisoned. On the small table beside him rests a manuscript unfinished, a mass for the dead. He calls it a requiem. There is something both beautiful and merciless in the image of a man composing music for the departed, not knowing he may be writing it for himself. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. We remember him as a genius of light. Melodies so clear, so balanced, they seem almost weightless. Music that could still an entire hall into breathless silence. Yet behind that radiance was a man who lived quickly. He laughed loudly, spent freely, worked until his strength gave way, and carried within him a restless need to prove something to the world. He once played before an empress. He once stood at the very center of a glittering Vienna. He once made an entire city lean forward to listen. And then quietly, he left. No monument, no orchestra walking behind him, no final applause. What happened between those two extremes, between brilliance and silence, between genius and a heart so very fragile? If you are drawn to stories told at this unhurried pace, I invite you to subscribe and leave a comment about the life you would like us to explore next. Your support allows journeys like this one to continue. And now, tonight we will not begin with legend. We will begin with silence. Let your breathing slow. Let Vienna emerge through the haze of winter. Let the story carry you back to his final morning. This is the journey of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and it begins with a horse-drawn carriage moving forward without an orchestra behind it. Chapter 1. Mozart dies in silence. The truth about the funeral of 1791. Vienna, December 1791. Morning lingers beneath a thin veil of mist clinging to tiled roofs and dark wooden doors. The snow does not fall in thick sheets. It settles quietly along the streets as though this city has grown accustomed to witnessing departures that make no sound. A small horse-drawn carriage rolls out of a narrow alley. No black banners, no musicians, no crowd following behind. The wheels press into the frozen mud, releasing the dry, brittle sound of wood against iron. The driver does not turn his head. Inside a simple pine coffin lies the body of a 35-year-old man. His name is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. If someone had stood at the corner and asked who had just passed, they might have offered a shrug. Vienna at this moment is crowded with musicians, composers, and performers. The city knows the language of strings and keys. It knows rivalry. It knows that talent appears, burns brightly, and disappears. The carriage continues toward St. Mark's Cemetery beyond the walls of Vienna. He is buried according to the funeral reforms issued in 1784 by Emperor Joseph II. This is the customary burial for the middle class of the time, not the pauper's fate later legend would describe. There is no private family grave, no individual stone. After some years, the exact place will no longer be marked. History will later drape this scene in drama. They will say he was poisoned, They will say he died in extreme poverty, abandoned, betrayed. But the truth is colder and perhaps far more sorrowful. He died of illness. Contemporary medical notes describe a high fever accompanied by swelling. Modern theories often point to severe infection or complications of acute rheumatic disease. There is no reliable evidence of poisoning. The rumors, especially those entangling him with Salieri, did not fully take root until years later, when 19th-century romantic imagination began searching for a tragedy grand enough to match a genius. Yet what unsettles us is not the cause of death. It is the silence. A man who once made an entire court hold its breath when his fingers touched the keys is now carried away without a single official farewell in music. Not because Vienna despised him, nor because he was unknown. Life simply moved forward. The theaters remained open. Other concerts went on as planned. Aristocrats occupied themselves with winter balls. The Habsburg Empire wrestled with war and financial strain. In Vienna, music does not pause for one life, even when that life is Mozart. In the small apartment where he drew his final breath, his wife Constanze was too weak to follow the carriage to the cemetery. She had only recently given birth, her body still fragile. To many of their contemporaries, this was simply a burial carried out according to regulation, not a moment that history would one day pause to remember. Perhaps only a handful of friends accompanied the carriage beyond the city gates. At the time, it was not customary nor required to follow the coffin all the way to the gravesite. Once the coffin was lowered into a communal grave, the earth was filled in. No stone marked the ground. No plaque bore his name. Only cold soil, thin snow, and the December wind moving across unmarked graves. And yet the paradox of this story does not lie in that image. The paradox is this: the man lowered into the frozen earth was not one who had burned himself out. In the final year of his life, he worked with an intensity that would have wearied men far younger. A new opera had just been brought to the stage. A concerto had been completed, and on his writing desk rested an unfinished mass for the dead. The music was still flowing. In those last days, he told Constanze that he believed he was writing the Requiem for himself. A messenger in a gray cloak had arrived with a commission on behalf of an anonymous count. Later, the story would be embroidered into legend. At that moment, it was simply a private agreement between two men who did not know one another. Mozart worked as though driven by something unseen. Fevered, he still sang out choral passages so his students could copy them down. He lay in bed and conducted with his voice. When they reached the Lacrimosa, a friend later recalled that he wept. 8 measures. Then it breaks. No one knows whether he truly sensed his own approaching death. What we do know is that he did not write like a man retreating from the world. Perhaps deep within, Mozart feared something more than poverty. He feared that no one would be listening. The carriage that bore his coffin has long since left the cemetery. The city continues to breathe. Snow begins to soften as a pale sun presses through the gray clouds. No music rose above his grave that day. And yet only a few years earlier, this very Vienna had spoken his name in a different tone, not with pity, not with indifference, but with expectation. How does a man step from the center of attention to the edge of silence in so brief a span? To understand that quiet death, we cannot begin with childhood. We must look instead at the light in which he once stood. Sometimes tragedy does not grow out of darkness. It begins in the middle of applause. Chapter 2. Mozart in Vienna. From the height of fame to a fragile light. Vienna spring of 1784. Candlelight shimmers against tall mirrors that rise toward the ceiling of a grand hall. Velvet sleeves brush softly as guests settle into their seats. Folding fans close with a whisper. The murmur of conversation dissolves into a single field of expectation. Then he steps forward. No longer the touring prodigy of distant courts. No longer the court musician in service to the Archbishop of Salzburg. Before them stands a man of 28, confident, quick in movement, eyes bright breath, slightly hurried as if the music is already a step ahead of him. He bows, and Vienna listens. In the early years after leaving Salzburg in 1781, Mozart chose to remain in Vienna rather than return to the service of Archbishop Colloredo. It was a daring decision. In the 18th century, most musicians were civil servants of a court. A fixed salary, a defined post. In exchange, obedience. Mozart wanted more. He wanted freedom. Vienna at that time was the musical heart of Europe. Here he experimented with a model few had pursued so boldly. He organized subscription concerts under his own direction. Audiences registered in advance. He composed new concertos. He conducted from the keyboard while performing as soloist. He sold works to publishers. He taught the daughters of noble families. Money flowed in. In the years 1784 and 1785, his income ranked among the higher tiers of Vienna's musicians. Estimates vary, yet many scholars suggest he earned several thousand florins annually during that brilliant period. Compared to court players or teachers, it was a significant sum. He rented a larger apartment. He purchased a finer instrument. He wore velvet coats. He attended parties. He played billiards. He laughed loudly. He wrote letters sparkling with wit. Mozart did not live as a victim. He lived as a man who believed he deserved to be heard. There is a subtle difference between the two. He did not need money alone. He needed an audience. Since childhood, whenever his fingers touched the keys, adults had smiled. Whenever he improvised, there had been gasps of admiration. His entire youth had been nourished by attentive eyes. Vienna offered that attention on a larger scale. Concerts filled to capacity. Applause that lingered in the air. Evenings when the name Mozart was spoken as a promise of something worth experiencing. He believed he belonged here. But light is never fixed. From around 1788 onward, war between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman forces weakened the treasury. Noble families began tightening their expenditures. Entertainment was among the first luxuries to be reduced. Fewer music lessons were commissioned. Private salons lost some of their former brilliance. Music did not disappear, but easy spending did. Tastes began to shift. Simple melodies, easy to remember, grew more fashionable. Some of Mozart's works, with their intricate architecture and unexpected turns of key, did not always yield themselves gently to the crowd. There was no single evening when Vienna turned its back on him. There were only small gaps that began appearing between performances. One night, returning from a concert less full than he had hoped, he sat alone at the keyboard. The room was still warm, but the applause no longer echoed in his ears. Only the faint scent of spent candle wax and the soft creak of wood beneath the chair. Fame does not collapse in a single night. It recedes like the tide. At first, you do not notice. You remain where you are certain the water will return to its former line. Then one day you look down and see more sand exposed at your feet. Mozart was not cast out by society. He remained respected among professionals. Other musicians understood his worth. Students continued to seek him out. But respect does not always walk hand in hand with financial stability. And Mozart was not cautious with money. When it flowed, he expanded his life to match its rhythm. When it slowed, he tightened gradually. He borrowed. He promised repayment. This was not uncommon among artists of the time, yet it created a quiet, persistent pressure. The pressure did not come only from bills. It came from the feeling of slipping away from the center. He had once commanded the room. Once it was the point toward which every gaze converged. Now he had to wonder whether the audience was still waiting for him. The paradox is that during those strained economic years, he composed his final 3 symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41. Works later generations would regard as summits of the classical era. It remains unclear how widely they were performed during his lifetime. But they existed, complete, assured, as though he were writing for a future beyond the room before him. This is what makes Mozart easy to misunderstand. He was not a genius crushed by a blind society. He was a man standing in the midst of an age in transition. The old patronage system was weakening. The free market for music had not yet fully formed. He left Salzburg to escape the position of a servant within a palace, yet the freedom he claimed came bound to risks no one had clearly defined. He did not fail. He experimented, and that experiment required him to live between 2 currents. Some choose safety. Mozart chose to stand in the flow, and the current never stands still. By 1791, the light had partially returned, especially with the success of the Magic Flute. The theaters were fuller again. His name was spoken more often, but his body could no longer keep pace. What misleads us is that his death came so early. In looking back, we are tempted to gather all his final years into a single seamless tragedy. The reality was more intricate. Months of success intertwined with months of worry. Evenings of crowded halls followed by nights of empty seats. Mozart did not live in total darkness. He lived in a light that flickered, and perhaps what unsettled him most was not money. It was attention. Since childhood, he had learned that music brought love. When he played, people listened. When he composed, they marveled. His entire life was bound to that moment when a room fell silent because of him. If that silence vanished, what would remain? Fame does not collapse in a night. It simply withdraws. And the man who once stood in the grand hall, surrounded by candlelight and resounding applause, began to feel the widening space around him. Not yet darkness, only a light no longer as certain as before. Chapter 3. Mozart's Music. Why do some say he heard God? Why are there melodies that make us feel smaller? Not smaller in fear. Smaller because we have been placed gently in our rightful position within something vast. Some say that when they listen to Mozart, they see light. Others speak of peace. Some cannot explain it at all. They only know their heartbeat slows, as if an unseen hand has come to rest upon their shoulder. What is striking is that this music carries no weight of oppression. It does not force us into sorrow. It does not demand that we struggle. It opens. Mozart belongs to the classical era, an age that believed in balance. In architecture, symmetry was sought. In philosophy, reason. In society, order. Music followed the same impulse. Clear structures. A theme appears, unfolds, and returns. Yet in his hands that balance is never cold. It breathes. Mozart wrote quickly. The manuscripts that remain often show remarkably few corrections, not because he was careless, but because the music seems to have been fully formed in his mind before it ever touched the page. He heard it whole the way another person might hear a familiar story told many times before. This does not mean he did not labor. It means the labor took place within. When a Mozart piano concerto begins, it often feels as though a door has opened. The orchestra introduces the space. Then the piano enters not to compete but to converse. It is dialogue more than confrontation, far from the stormy clashes we later associate with Beethoven. A question, an answer, a fleeting smile. And somewhere within those unexpected modulations, the listener realizes they are being led down a corridor they did not know existed. Mozart possessed a rare ability to make complexity feel natural. Subtle harmonic layers, daring shifts of key, intricate counterpoint, all concealed beneath an appearance of ease. Like a still lake hiding deep currents below its surface, the listener does not need theory, only attention. Perhaps that is why so many describe his music as transparent. Not because it is simple, but because it does not weigh upon the spirit. It does not drag us to the bottom of emotion before releasing us. It lifts us just enough to see beyond ourselves. This is especially clear in his operatic arias. A character may suffer, yet the melody does not suffocate the listener. It allows pain to exist within the frame of beauty, as if to suggest that tragedy itself belongs to a greater order. In The Marriage of Figaro, A servant may sing with intelligence equal to his master. In Don Giovanni, laughter and death stand side by side, without canceling one another. In Mozart, light and shadow do not exclude each other. They remain in balance. This is not innocence. It is a way of seeing the world. The 18th century was the age of enlightenment. Reason was believed capable of illuminating the darkness of superstition. Structure mattered. Law mattered. The universe itself was thought to be knowable in its order. Mozart absorbed that spirit. Yet he did not write as a philosopher. He wrote as a storyteller. His music carries a profound human warmth. The characters who step onto his stage are not rigid symbols. They are jealous. They fall in love. They are afraid. They make mistakes. And he does not judge them. He gives them a melody. Perhaps that is why listeners feel understood. Not because Mozart speaks in their place, but because he places their emotions into a form they can bear. Imagine an evening in Vienna, a crowded room, the scent of melted candle wax blending with polished wood. When the slow movement of a concerto begins, the hall grows still, not because silence is enforced, but because the music has created a shared space in which each person hears something private. That is a rare power. Beethoven would later drive music to the very edge of emotion, wrestling with fate, with fury, with defiance. Mozart stands elsewhere. He does not need to shout to be heard. He sets each element in its proper place. That balance has sometimes led others to call him light. Light does not mean shallow. It is like daylight. We grow so accustomed to it that we forget the immense force burning far away to make it possible. Mozart does not show us the burning. He shows us the light. There are passages in the Requiem, especially in the Lacrimosa, commissioned in secrecy near the end of his life, where the music seems to step beyond its familiar equilibrium. Pain is more visible there. The shadows deepen. Yet even in those measures, a thread of order remains. There is no total collapse. The music still believes in structure. Perhaps that is why it has outlived him. A person may be forgotten when the social spotlight fades. But a perfectly formed musical structure does not depend on passing taste. It stands like architecture. People may step away from it for a time. When they return, it is still there. Mozart did not build towering monuments. He built rooms with windows open to the sky. Those who enter may not immediately recognize the quiet wonder. Yet when they leave, something subtle has shifted. The heartbeat steadier, the thoughts clearer, emotions given a name. That is what sets him apart. Not the speed at which he wrote, not the sheer number of works, but the ability to transform human chaos into something that can be sung. And so the question circles back to where we began. If a man could hear order in sound so clearly, what shaped that ear? What in his earliest years taught him to listen to the world with such balance? To answer, we must leave Vienna, return to a small city beneath the Alps, where a boy did not simply learn to play, he learned to listen. Chapter 4. Mozart's Childhood. the 6-year-old before Empress Maria Theresa. The Empress looks down. The child standing before her is almost too small for the instrument. His feet do not fully reach the floor as he sits. Powdered white hair rests lightly on narrow shoulders. The room is so vast that even a breath seems capable of echoing. He bows his head, then places his hands upon the keys. Vienna in 1762 does not know it is witnessing a legend. To those present, this is simply a 6-year-old boy from Salzburg, a small city beneath the Alps. A territory ruled by an archbishop within the Holy Roman Empire, where church bells mark each morning and authority rests in ecclesiastical hands. The boy's name is Wolfgang. Born on January 27, 1756, in a modest house on Getreidegasse in Salzburg. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart did not enter the world beneath stage lights. He arrived among the scent of candle wax, the sound of his father's violin, and the steady rhythm of a middle-class household in service to a church court. There were 7 children in the family. Only 2 survived. His sister Maria Anna called Nannerl and the young Wolfgang. The deaths of the other children were not unusual in the 18th century. Yet each loss left the small house a little quieter. And perhaps because of that, the 2 who remained were regarded differently, not only as children, but as what was left of the future. Wolfgang's father, Leopold Mozart, was a disciplined musician and teacher. He authored a respected violin manual. He understood structure. He understood method. He knew that talent, if not shaped, would evaporate like breath upon glass. He also understood something else. Europe was changing. The Enlightenment had opened salons and drawing rooms where nobles competed not only with titles, but with art. A child who could play brilliantly was no longer merely a family delight. He was an event. Leopold saw this early. When Wolfgang was 3, he watched his sister's lessons with intense concentration. At 4, he could play short pieces. At 5, he began setting down his first notes on paper. Not flawless, but formed with intention. Leopold was not only a proud father, he was an observer. He recorded, he tested, he challenged his son's musical memory. He covered the keys to see if Wolfgang could play without looking. He devised small exercises disguised as games, and the boy responded with joy. There is no clear evidence that those early years were marked by harsh coercion. Wolfgang laughed at the keyboard. He delighted in surprising adults. He loved the murmurs of admiration, the widening eyes of visitors to the house. For him, music was first a game. But that game soon outgrew the family room. In 1762, Leopold brought both children to Munich to perform before the Bavarian court. Soon after they traveled to Vienna, and in a resplendent chamber of the Habsburg court, Wolfgang sat before Empress Maria Theresa. There are stories that after the performance, the boy slipped on the polished floor and was lifted up by a young archduchess. That he innocently declared he would marry her one day. Perhaps the tale was embroidered later. Yet the image endures because it fits what people wish to believe, that genius can also be innocent. In that room, what mattered was not innocence. It was precision. Wolfgang did not play like a child imitating adults. He handled simple musical structures with astonishing accuracy for someone so young. He could remember a theme after hearing it once. He improvised. Skills that required decades of discipline in others seemed to unfold in him without strain. But consider the scene from another angle. A 6-year-old standing among silk gowns, towering wigs, and measuring eyes. He bows with proper form. He pleases the adults. He learns to enter a room understanding that he is there to be heard. Very early, Wolfgang absorbed this truth. Music brings attention. Attention brings love. And love can be conditional. Salzburg was not Paris or Vienna. It was a small city whose rhythm turned around the church and the archiepiscopal court. Damp stone streets carrying the scent of rain. Morning bells echoing through narrow lanes. Evenings quieter than any great capital. Their music was service. A musician was a court employee. Leopold understood those limits. He did not want his son confined to a modest post in a local court. He believed this talent had to be seen more widely. And so the journeys began. Carriages rolled over muddy roads. Winters bit with cold. Summers rose in clouds of dust. The two children changed clothes in damp inns, then stepped into noble salons, as though they had been born to stand there. Wolfgang grew up in motion. No fixed circle of friends, no familiar playground. Rooms changed, cities changed, audiences changed. Only the keyboard remained. In the years that followed, as the tours stretched across Europe, he learned more than technique. He absorbed Italian style in one city, French rhythm in another, German rigor elsewhere. The music of Europe opened before him like a map. But each performance carried another lesson. Bow, smile, play perfectly, and listen for the applause. A child taught that his worth was bound to the moment when a room fell silent because of him. That lesson would follow him for life. Nights in Salzburg were quieter than those in Vienna. When the family returned from their travels, the house on Getreidegasse once again filled with the warm scent of wood and paper. Leopold copied out his son's compositions. Nannerl practiced in a corner. Wolfgang could not yet know he was becoming a symbol. He only knew that when his fingers touched the keys, the world arranged itself. Perhaps it was there in that small house amid candle wax and his father's violin that his extraordinary ear began to take shape. Not only hearing sound, but hearing structure. Not only hearing applause, but hearing the silence before it. The 6-year-old before the Empress did not know what his future would hold. But from that moment on, his life no longer belonged entirely to him. The carriage had begun to move, and this time it would not stop for many years. Chapter 5. Leopold Mozart, the father behind a genius. The night in Salzburg is quieter than in any city they have passed through. Wind slides along the tiled roofs. Inside the house on Getreidegasse, a candle still burns late. The two children are asleep. Only Leopold remains at the table, a violin resting across his knees, his gaze fixed not on the sheet music before him, but on the future. His son is not like other children. He knows this. But knowing is one thing. Turning it into destiny is another. Leopold Mozart is no blind dreamer. Born in 1719, he understands the structure of the society in which he lives. In Salzburg, a court musician in service to the archbishop can live securely, yet is rarely remembered. Art here is a position, not a legacy. He once held ambitions beyond Salzburg, yet the realities of the age did not easily open doors. Then Wolfgang arrives, not only as a son, but as a door. Beginning in 1763, the family embarks on their longest tour, lasting nearly 3 years and taking them through Munich, Mannheim, Paris, London, and The Hague. The carriage rattles over muddy roads. Winter seals the windows with frost. Summer dust clings to sleeves and collars. The children change clothes in damp inns scented with sweat and old wood. Then step into glittering salons as if no distance separates the two worlds. Leopold manages everything. Letters, performance schedules, relations with nobles, fees. He writes almost weekly, recording audience reactions, payments received, and opportunities emerging, not to boast, but because he understands that memory must be preserved if it is to endure. Wolfgang is 7, 8, or 9 years old. He learns to enter a room and read its atmosphere before touching the keys. In Paris, charm is prized. In London, curiosity about improvisation reigns. In Mannheim, the refinement of the orchestra widens his ear. During these years of travel, Wolfgang absorbs the varied styles of Europe. Johann Christian Bach's influence in London leaves a particularly deep imprint, shaping the lyrical clarity that would later define Mozart's concerto language. Yet the journeys are not only light. In The Hague, both Wolfgang and Nano fall gravely ill, likely with typhoid fever. The rented room is not magnificent then. No nobles gather. Only the smell of medicine, the heat of fever, and the uneven rhythm of breath. Leopold sits beside the bed. Genius is not immune to sickness. He knows this. And perhaps for the first time, he senses the risk woven into the dream he is pursuing. But when Wolfgang recovers and returns to the keyboard, the halls open once more. Applause rises again. The carriage rolls forward. In London, Wolfgang meets Johann Christian Bach, the youngest son of Johann Sebastian Bach. Younger than Leopold, elegant and approachable, he sits beside the boy at the keyboard. They play 4 hands together. The influence runs deep. The graceful melodies and lucid structures of the London Bach become part of Mozart's musical language. Leopold watches it all. He does not want his son merely to be famous. He wants him to be complete. And between those two desires, a tension quietly lives. The greater Wolfgang's success became the more he stood at the center of attention. Nobles invited him to perform in private chambers. Praise was addressed directly to him, no longer passing through his father. There were evenings when Leopold stood nearby, present, but no longer the one admired. He felt pride. and he understood that his role was quietly shifting. Leopold's love for his son is beyond dispute. The letters he wrote when separated from him are filled with tenderness and concern. He addressed Wolfgang with affectionate nicknames. He prayed for his health, yet he also controlled. He chose the routes, the contracts, the moment to leave one city for another. He revised Wolfgang's early compositions. He instructed him in manners, in speech, in how to enter a room and be seen. In a world where gifted children could easily be exploited, Leopold had reason to be cautious. But for a growing child, protection can also become a frame. Wolfgang did not grow up in a single familiar room, but inside a schedule. Not among companions his own age, but among adults. He learned how to speak to a duke before he ever learned how to quarrel with a peer. He learned how to enter a room and understand what must be done to be heard. When to bow, when to smile, when to add an improvised flourish that would draw a murmur of delight. Not to become great, but to be accepted in that world. At the same time, he learned to keep his back straight when tired, to keep smiling when sleepy, to remain silent while adults spoke. There were nights after performances when the guests had gone, and the candles burned low, when Wolfgang still overflowed with energy. He leapt about the rented room, laughed loudly, teased his sister. That liveliness may have been temperament, or it may have been release after hours of restraint. Leopold saw two versions of his son, the mischievous child and the serious artist. He wished to preserve both. The world did not always allow it. By the early 1770s, the grand tours began to thin. Wolfgang was no longer the tiny marvel at the keyboard. He had grown taller. His voice had deepened. The roundness of childhood was fading from his face. Prodigy has an invisible limit. When audiences no longer see a small child at the instrument, they begin to listen with different ears. Leopold understood this before Wolfgang did. He knew the season of wonder would pass. What remained would have to be substance. So he pressed his son further. Counterpoint, symphony, the study of Italian opera during later journeys to Milan. A father's love and a manager's ambition. So closely intertwined, they are difficult to separate. Wolfgang grew beneath the shadow of the man who had opened the doors for him. That shadow offered shade, and it narrowed the horizon. After each journey, Salzburg seemed a little smaller, and the world beyond it a little wider. Leopold once believed he was leading his son across Europe. Gradually, it was Wolfgang who began to lead him. One day the son would no longer wish to follow a path already drawn. One day applause would not be enough. And when that day came, father and son would face a question more difficult than any score. What is the price of freedom, and who will pay for it? Chapter 6. An Unusual Childhood. Mozart and the Years on the Road. Across Europe. There is a room somewhere in Europe in the year 1766. Not a concert hall. Not a palace. Just a small rented room. Damp walls. A window blurred by mist. Outside, carriage wheels have only just come to rest after a long journey. Inside, two children change into their performance clothes. A velvet coat is hung carefully on a hook. A small pair of shoes is placed neatly beside the bed. An 8-year-old boy sits at the edge of the mattress. There is no applause now, only silence. Wolfgang's childhood does not unfold in a single courtyard or along a familiar street. It stretches across a map, small dots connecting Munich to Paris, London to The Hague, back to Salzburg, then outward again. He learns to remember the route to a theater before he learns the path out of a garden. In many cities, Wolfgang has no friends. He has audiences. Adults smile, adults applaud, adults marvel. But when the performance ends, they return to their own lives. He climbs back into the carriage. There are mornings when he needs a few seconds to remember which city he is in. He knows only that tonight there will be another room, another instrument, another space that must be won. Gradually, this feeling becomes normal. Instability becomes rhythm. For many children, childhood is repetition. The same street, the same companions, the same hour for supper. For Wolfgang, everything shifts. The world expands faster than a child can fully understand. Yet in exchange, he gains something rare, an ear that widens. Each city carries its own color of sound. In Paris, elegance of rhythm. In London, brightness and balance of melody. Later, in Italian churches, choirs rising like domes opening toward the sky. Wolfgang absorbs it all. Not as a collector, but as a curious child. There are times when he hears a piece once and can play it back almost in full. Adults stare in astonishment. For Wolfgang, it is not magic. It is survival. Listen deeply. Remember quickly. The world around him is always in motion. But every gift carries its cost. In 1767, smallpox spreads in Vienna. The Mozart family must leave in haste. Wolfgang falls ill. Faint scars remain on his face for the rest of his life. Genius has a fragile body, high fever, the scent of medicine, windows kept closed. In those days confined to bed, there is no audience, no shimmering candlelight, only breath and heartbeat. An 8 or 9-year-old child learns another lesson. The body has limits. That admiration cannot prevent disease. After each recovery, Wolfgang returns to the keyboard. Music is no longer only performance. It is the one place that does not change when cities do. And in the long intervals between journeys, something else quietly forms. Perhaps it is during these years that Wolfgang begins to measure his worth by the response of a room. When an entire childhood is bound to the moment, a room falls silent because of you, you begin to believe that silence is the measure of your worth. If no eyes are watching, do you still fully exist? Wolfgang cannot yet form that question in words, but his body remembers. It remembers the sensation before entering a room, the quickened heartbeat at the first touch of the keys, the surge of applause rising like a wave, and the emptiness that follows. There are evenings when the family remains in one city a little longer. Wolfgang looks out the window and sees local children at play. He watches, Perhaps he smiles. Rarely does he join them. Tomorrow they may leave. Temporary attachments can wound. So he binds himself to the one thing that always travels with him: music. There he does not need to introduce himself. He does not need to explain where he comes from. He places his hands on the keyboard and the world arranges itself again. Leopold sees the talent growing, but he sees something else as well. Wolfgang always seems to stand between worlds. Salzburg is home yet too small. Paris too loud. London too distant. Vienna too intricate. He belongs fully to none of them. Between cities, between styles, between childhood and adulthood. A childhood without a true childhood. Not because joy is absent, but because stability is. In letters Leopold writes to his wife while traveling, he often praises Wolfgang's obedience and diligence. Yet between those lines lies something unspoken. The boy is growing too quickly. At 12, Wolfgang writes symphonies. At 14, he composes an opera for Milan. Audiences no longer see a charming curiosity. They begin to judge the work itself. Expectations shift. The child prodigy slowly becomes a responsibility, no longer the miraculous boy, but the composer who must prove himself. The transformation is quiet, yet profound. A child once loved for what he is, now measured by what he produces. The distance between those two states is fragile. Perhaps that is why throughout his life, Wolfgang preserves a streak of playful humor. The jokes, the whimsical letters. As if somewhere deep within the boy still wishes to be seen, not as a symbol, but as a person. The world does not easily separate the two. As the carriage continues over the stone roads of Europe, Wolfgang comes to understand something more clearly. Music can open doors, but it can also bind. And somewhere in those adolescent years, a vague longing begins to take shape, not only to be heard, but to decide what he will play, not only to enter rooms arranged by his father's schedule, but to choose his own. When the prodigy grows older, the world no longer looks at him with the same eyes. And soon Wolfgang will no longer look at the world with the same eyes either. The carriage keeps moving. But this time the one seated inside begins to wonder, will he ever step down where he chooses? Chapter 7. Mozart leaves Salzburg, the decision that changed the course of music. Vienna, late spring of 1781. In a long corridor of the Archbishop's palace, a young man stands waiting. His coat is neat, his hair tied back with care, but his hands are clenched behind his back. Not from cold, from anger. Wolfgang is 25, no longer the miraculous child. No longer the adolescent composing opera for Milan. He is a grown musician in service to Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo of Salzburg, temporarily accompanying his employer to Vienna. The title sounds respectable. Court musician. The reality is otherwise. He is seated with the servants at meals. He waits for instructions. He composes on command. He plays when summoned. He remains silent when he is not required. Salzburg has never been large enough for his ambition. Vienna is different. Vienna is the musical center of the German-speaking world, a city where Italian opera is debated with fervor, where nobles compete through private orchestras, where the name Mozart has once been spoken in glittering concert seasons. And now he stands in that city as an employee. Conflict does not erupt in a single day. It accumulates. Colorado is a reformer. He prefers shorter church music, less display, less length. He regards musicians as civil servants, not as geniuses. Mozart does not resist reform. He resists the way he is treated. There are dinners where he must sit below others. Moments when he is reprimanded like a boy, occasions when he waits outside doors while noblemen are received inside. For someone who once made an empress listen, this is not mere inconvenience. It is humiliation. In letters home, Leopold urges patience. A stable position is worth more than impulsive pride. Reputation cannot sustain a life as reliably as a fixed salary. Leopold understands the system. Wolfgang wants to break it. Vienna in 1781 offers a possibility. Emperor Joseph II is experimenting with a German-language opera. Reform is in the air. Artists begin to imagine greater independence than before. Mozart senses it the way a sailor senses a shift in wind. But before freedom comes, something must tear. The confrontation follows weeks of strain. Mozart asks to be released from his duties to the archbishop. Colorado refuses. He orders Mozart to return to Salzburg. Mozart does not wish to return. He does not want to go back to the city where everyone has known him since childhood, where he is always Leopold's son, where the ceilings feel too low for his new ambitions. The argument escalates. At last, in early June of 1781, Mozart is dismissed from service. According to his later account, the archbishop's steward, Count Arco, literally kicks him out the door. Historians debate the exact details. What remains certain is that the relationship ends. He loses his position, and for the first time in his life, he belongs to no patron. Pause there for a moment. The 18th century is not an age of freelance artists. Musicians survive through patronage, court, church, aristocracy. No salary means no security. No contract means no future. Mozart knows this. Leopold knows it even more deeply. In anxious letters, the father urges his son to return. Salzburg may be narrow, but it is secure. Vienna is vast and without a safety net. Wolfgang reads the letters and stays. The decision is not merely professional, it is a severing. For 25 years, Leopold has been the guide, the arranger, the negotiator, the shield. Now his son chooses a path that has not been approved. For the first time, Wolfgang wagers on himself. No fixed salary, no official title, only talent and Vienna. There is a paradox here. Mozart does not leave the system because he is destitute. He leaves because he believes he can be more. He believes his music should not be shortened to fit ceremony, not confined to liturgical hours, not treated as an administrative duty. He wants to write an opera, to organize his own concerts, to be paid directly by those who come to listen. It is a bold idea, almost reckless, yet inevitable for someone raised between applause and the map of Europe. If his childhood was a sequence of rooms chosen by others, then at 25 he chooses his own door. Freedom does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives with bills. Vienna does not roll out a carpet. He must find students, rent halls, persuade nobles to subscribe in advance to his concert series. Each decision carries risk, but also a new sensation. No more bowing in palace corridors. No more waiting for orders. In his early months in Vienna, Mozart works with unusual intensity, as if he can finally breathe deeply. Freedom has its own scent, not the perfume of aristocracy, but the smell of freshly printed music. Ink still drying, the unfamiliar air of rented rooms. Yet beneath the exhilaration, a quiet question forms. If there is no patron who will remain when the hall grows thin, Wolfgang does not yet know. He knows only this: better to fail in freedom than to succeed inside a frame too small. Vienna opens before him, wide, noisy, full of promise, and unforgiving. The cord has been cut. Now he must learn to stand without it. Chapter 8. Mozart. One of Europe's first independent artists. What did freedom mean in the 18th century? Not a slogan, not a manifesto. For a musician, freedom meant simply this: not having to wait for someone else's command. Vienna, 1782. Mozart wakes in a rented apartment. There is no court uniform laid out for him, no schedule dictated by another hand. On his desk lie unfinished manuscripts. By the window, the pale light of a winter morning. No one pays him a fixed salary anymore. And that is both exhilaration and unease. The first months after leaving patronage are not bathed in glory. They are careful steps. He must find students, knock on the doors of noble households, prove that he is not merely a name once admired, but a teacher worth the fee. A morning may begin with guiding a young woman through a simple sonata. Midday brings negotiation over payment. Afternoon sends him across the city to another home. Only at night, when Vienna grows quiet, does he return to his desk and begin the work that truly belongs to him. Freedom has no fixed hours, but it has a cost. Mozart begins organizing concerts under his own direction. He rents halls, invites audiences to subscribe in advance, composes new piano concertos to perform himself. It is not entirely unprecedented. But in Vienna, where patronage remains the norm, it is bold. He no longer depends on a single employer. He depends on the market. The distinction is subtle. At court, if a performance falters, the monthly salary still arrives. For an independent artist, each concert is a wager. If the audience is thin, the rent must still be paid. The musicians must still receive their fees. Mozart is no longer only a composer. He is an organizer, a promoter, a calculator. A list of subscribers rests on his table. A deposit awaits confirmation. A violinist complains that payment has not yet come. Freedom carries its own scent, not the perfume of aristocratic salons, but the smell of fresh ink on printed announcements, candle wax melting in rented rooms, paper folded carefully and tucked away promises of payment yet to be fulfilled. There are evenings when the hall glows with light. When Mozart steps forward and takes his seat at the keyboard, the room falls still. He is no longer an employee. He is the center. The orchestra waits for his signal. The audience waits for his first touch of the keys. In the middle years of the 1780s, this model finds its rhythm. His academies draw attention. He writes one piano concerto after another, each a refined conversation between the individual and the collective. At times, his income is high, strong enough for him to believe he has chosen wisely. Yet the truth lies in the daily rhythm. If he falls ill, there is no pay. If new students do not appear, income thins. If a noble family leaves the city or tightens its spending, his list of lessons grows shorter at once. Freedom offers no safety net. It offers responsibility. In 1784, Mozart joins the Freemasons. In private gatherings, he meets men who believe in reason, in reform and brotherhood that reaches beyond class. Vienna is not only a marketplace, it is a new atmosphere. His music in these years expands as well, more refined, more balanced. No longer written merely to impress, but to explore. Yet alongside creation, something else takes shape. An invisible pressure. Within a system, if he felt constrained, he could blame ceremony or his superiors. In freedom, every success and every failure carries his own name. There are nights after concerts, when the audience has long since departed, that Mozart remains seated at the keyboard. Not to play, simply to think. What if fewer subscribers come next season? What if a new talent captures the city's attention? What if public taste shifts? Vienna loves talent, but Vienna is not loyal. By the late 1780s, economic winds begin to turn. War and financial strain will make the aristocracy more cautious with their spending. Lavish concerts are no longer as easily filled. Mozart continues to work, continues to compose, continues to teach, but the steady rhythm of his most brilliant years is no longer intact. What is remarkable is not that he collapses, it is that he keeps trying. He does not return to Salzburg. He does not ask for his old position. He does not seek another patron to replace Colorado. He remains in Vienna. He remains with the model he has chosen. An independent artist is not someone without ties. It is someone who chooses his ties. Mozart has chosen. He chooses to live with risk. He chooses to believe the audience will come. He chooses to place his future in subscription lists and halls he must fill himself. On his desk, two things always lie side by side: an open score and a list of debts. The distance between them is very small. And within that narrow space, Mozart lives the boldest years of his life. Chapter 9. Mozart and Constanze. Love, marriage, and unpaid bills. One summer evening in 1782, in an apartment not far from the center of Vienna, Mozart sits at his writing desk. The window is open. The sound of carriage wheels fades into the distance. In the next room, laughter rises. Not the laughter of aristocrats, not polite and measured, but full, unguarded laughter. Her name is Constanze Weber. Mozart had known the Weber family years earlier during his search for opportunity in Mannheim. Then it was her sister Aloysia who had captured his young affection. That chapter passed like a melody that never quite finds its climax. When he encounters the Webers again in Vienna, he is no longer the dreamer traveling from court to court. He is 26, newly severed from patronage, trying to build an independent life in a vast city. And in the midst of that effort, he draws closer to Constanze. She is not wealthy. She brings no significant dowry. She opens no political doors among the nobility. She opens another door. A room where he is not Herr Mozart, not the genius expected to astonish, not entirely shaped by Leopold's direction. Simply Wolfgang. They talk, they tease. Their letters are filled with playful nicknames and a kind of childlike humor that later generations sometimes find surprising. Genius does not always speak like a philosopher. At times he is only a man in love. Leopold objects. From Salzburg, his letters warn of haste, of responsibility, of reputation, of the danger in binding one's life before financial foundations are secure. Leopold does not trust the choice. He fears instability. Mozart understands and marries her anyway. In August 1782, at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Constanze Weber are wed. There is no grand spectacle, no flourish of ceremony, only a decision. The marriage is not socially advantageous, nor is it reckless infatuation clouding reason. It is a choice. Mozart understands, at least in part, the risks before him. He has just broken from Salzburg. His income comes from lessons and concerts he organizes himself. The model of independence is still experimental. He could have waited a few years. He does not wait. In the old world, a father directed the future. In the old system, a position defined status. Now Mozart chooses to determine both his profession and his family for himself. He chooses love without guarantee, and that choice makes the marriage both warm and fragile. Their life together begins in a modest apartment. In the years that follow, Constanze becomes pregnant 6 times. Only 2 of their children survive to adulthood. 4 die too young to leave memories. There is no separate requiem for each loss. Only silence in the room. Mornings without a cry. The quiet removal of a cradle. Mozart does not leave behind long, tragic diary entries. Yet the losses do not vanish. They fold themselves into his relentless rhythm of work, into periods when he throws himself into composition as if time itself were narrowing. Their small family lives according to the tide of money that arrives and recedes. Some months are comfortable, Others require borrowing from friends. The letters requesting financial help exist not because of laziness or reckless indulgence, but because the life of a freelance artist is rarely steady. Constanze is not overly strict with money, but neither is she the cause of their hardship. She lives beside Mozart within a model he himself has chosen. When income rises, their life expands with it. When it slows, they contract. It is the natural oscillation of freedom. Mozart now writes not only for reputation. He writes for the apartment they rent, for meals at the table, for the future of their children. Each new concerto is not only a work of art, it is rent. Each concert is not only light upon a stage, it is temporary stability for a household. There are evenings when Mozart sits beside the bed while Constanze, exhausted after childbirth, rests in silence. Mornings when he leaves early to teach hearing a child's cry behind the closing door. Genius does not live outside of life. He lives within it. Love does not resolve economics, but it gives a reason to keep writing. Perhaps what is deepest in this marriage is not romance. It is companionship. Constanze does not stand behind the spotlight as a symbol. She stands within the ordinary days, within bills, within fatigue, within the quiet joy when a concert succeeds. Mozart's freedom now has a witness, and someone who shares the risk. From the moment he speaks, his vow's freedom is no longer the story of a young man asserting himself against the world. It becomes the story of two people stepping into an uncertain future. Vienna still glitters outside. The soirees, the intellectual salons, the applause. But inside the modest apartment, between the scratch of pen on paper and the steady breathing of his wife beside him, Mozart begins to understand something new. Freedom is not only about escaping someone. It is choosing who will stand with you in uncertainty. And when the years ahead grow more difficult, when the light begins to flicker, when reputation feels less secure than before, this choice will make everything hurt more and feel more real. For he is no longer alone in that room, and because of that, every risk he takes now carries two beating hearts within it. Chapter 10. The Marriage of Figaro. When music touched politics and class. Europe, 1786. In intellectual salons, a dangerous subject is whispered about. Not war, not disease, a play. A few years earlier in Paris, a writer named Beaumarchais told a story in which a servant dares to confront his master, dares to speak plainly, dares to disturb an order long considered natural. The play was banned for a time, judged too bold. Now in Vienna, the center of an empire still anchored in class hierarchy, that story is about to be sung. Its name is The Marriage of Figaro, and the composer is Mozart. He is not a political revolutionary. He does not deliver speeches on equality in public squares. But he understands something simple. Music can soften what spoken words sharpen. Working with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart does not merely set a script to melody. He transforms it into a web of feeling, in which every character, master, or servant possesses depth. Figaro is a servant. Count Almaviva is a nobleman. In the old world, that boundary is not meant to tremble. Yet on Mozart's stage, Figaro does not speak as someone small. He sings with wit, with agile rhythm, with a confidence that approaches equality. The music refuses to make him lesser. That is the most dangerous gesture of all. Vienna in 1786 is not Paris on the eve of revolution, but Enlightenment ideas have slipped quietly into lodges, drawing rooms, and late-night conversations. Mozart is a Freemason. He believes in reason, in justice within a rational world. Yet he does not compose a manifesto. He writes a comic opera. There is wisdom in that. Comedy allows serious truths to pass unpunished. In Figaro, a count attempts to misuse his authority with a servant girl. A noblewoman suffers betrayal. Those beneath often prove sharper than those above. The audience laughs and recognizes something beneath the laughter. Order is not immutable. Mozart does not make Figaro thunder like a tragic hero. He gives him agility, quick arias sharp with intelligence, and the deepest moments belong to the Countess. A noble woman, yet a woman wounded and abandoned. Mozart does not take the side of any class. He takes the side of the human being. What makes Figaro extraordinary is not only its subject, but its structure. The characters do not sing in isolation. They overlap. Emotions intertwine. In the great ensemble finales, 5 or 6 voices weave together, each distinct yet bound within a single architecture, like society. No longer a single line, no longer one voice entirely dominating the rest. The premiere in Vienna in May 1786 is not an explosion. The audience responds warmly, but the success is measured. Some complain the music is too intricate, too many ensembles, too dense. Yet when the opera travels to Prague later that year, something shifts. Prague loves Figaro. People whistle its melodies in the streets. Themes echo in taverns. Mozart is welcomed as a musical hero. There is a subtle irony here. Vienna, the city he chose for his freedom, receives him with restraint. Prague, not the center of imperial power, listens more deeply. The triumph in Prague opens the door to another work darker and more searching. But before stepping into shadow, linger with Figaro a moment longer. This opera does not topple regimes. It does not ignite revolution. It does something quieter. It invites an audience seated in velvet and jewels to feel sympathy for a servant. And once sympathy begins, the old order has already begun to fracture. Mozart carries no banner. He carries a score. Yet sometimes notes placed precisely where they belong can be more unsettling than a speech. In his private life, Mozart continues to balance success with family responsibilities. He is not endlessly wealthy, not destitute. He lives within fluctuation. In art, however, he has reached a new maturity. Figaro is not the rebellion of youth. It is the assurance of someone who understands the architecture of power and chooses to play within it rather than collide head-on. The comedy ends in forgiveness. Couples are restored. Outward order appears intact, yet the audience leaves altered. They have heard a servant sing as an equal to a nobleman, and once something has been heard, it cannot be unheard. Mozart leaves the stage that night not as a revolutionary, but as a man who has shown that music can attempt what politics dares not speak openly. And when you begin to touch the structure of society, even through laughter, you step closer to the darker regions of the human heart. That darkness waits in the next work. A man without remorse, a supper invitation from beyond the grave, and laughter rising in the midst of hell. Chapter 11. Don Giovanni, Darkness, Desire and Death in Mozart's Music. Prague, autumn of 1787. The estate's theater glows with light. The audience enters in a rustle of cloaks and gloves. The air thickens as if something unnamed is about to take form. Mozart has returned to this city after the triumph of Figaro. Prague loves him in a way Vienna never fully has. Here his music is not dismissed as too intricate, not weighed down by fickle taste. Here he is listened to, and this time he brings a different story. No longer a comedy of class, no longer intrigues in aristocratic bedrooms. Now there is a man who feels no remorse. His name is Don Giovanni. The opera opens with a murder. No gentle overture, no careful introduction, only darkness, struggle, and death. Death will return. But first there is laughter. Don Giovanni is seductive, confident, unmoved by consequence. He passes through women as through doorways, without pause, without looking back. Lorenzo da Ponte shapes the libretto from the Don Juan legend, long present in European literature. In Mozart's hands, the character becomes more than a libertine. He becomes a force of nature. The music of Don Giovanni is not simply dark. It is alluring. The aria La ci darem la mano is so tender that it seems almost harmless. The melody drifts like a promise. Yet, beneath it lies manipulation, absorption, the quiet erasure of another will. Mozart does not stand above his characters in judgment. He lets the music speak. In Don Giovanni, comedy and tragedy are inseparable. Leporello's catalogue of conquests draws laughter. Then the ghost of the murdered father, the commendatore, appears. When the statue speaks, the music changes color. Low voices thicken. Harmonies grow heavy. The pulse slows like footsteps approaching from beyond sight. Mozart dares something few of his contemporaries attempt. He allows the supernatural to enter not as ornament, but as verdict. The premiere in Prague in October 1787 is a resounding success. Mozart conducts himself. The audience senses something different. Not mere entertainment, a question. What happens when a man lives entirely by desire? What happens when there is no limit? Here Mozart no longer touches the structure of society as in Figaro. He reaches into the structure within the human being. Don Giovanni represents no single class. He represents instinct, and instinct, unrestrained, consumes itself. What is striking is that Mozart does not conclude with a simple moral victory. Don Giovanni is dragged into hell in a scene of fierce theatrical power, almost violent in its force. Immediately after, the remaining characters return with a lighter, more conventional moral reflection. Two layers, one metaphysical, one social. As if Mozart himself is moving between two worlds. The year 1787 is also the year Leopold Mozart dies. The father who guided him, restrained him, opposed him, worried for him, is gone. That death does not appear explicitly in Don Giovanni. Yet it is difficult to believe Mozart does not feel a shift within himself. A father killed in the opening scene. A father's statue returning to demand justice. A young man dragged down because he refuses to kneel. There is no need to declare that Don Giovanni is Mozart, but it cannot be ignored that the shadow of the father and the shadow of death enter his music in a new way. If Figaro is the light of social intelligence, then Don Giovanni is the darkness of unrestrained freedom. Mozart at this moment stands at a creative peak, yet his financial life begins to waver. The years after 1786 are no longer as effortless as before. Concerts are not consistently full. Money does not flow as steadily. In music, he goes deeper. In life, the ground beneath him grows thinner. There is something striking about Don Giovanni. He does not repent. Even when the stone hand reaches toward him, he refuses to bow. That defiance carries something both terrifying and strangely admirable. Mozart offers no easy escape for the audience. Not everyone is saved. Not every story closes in reconciliation. Prague embraces the opera. Vienna responds with more restraint. Like the music itself, it is not easy to digest. After Don Giovanni, Mozart is no longer merely the composer of melodies described as light. He has touched something heavier. The presence of death not as sentimental tragedy, but as a force that does not negotiate. And once death has been invited onto the stage, it does not depart easily. The darkness in Don Giovanni is not Mozart's end, but it opens a door leading into his final years where light and shadow no longer stand apart. They begin to merge. Chapter 12. The difficult years, 1788 to 1790. Mozart, amid Vienna's economic strain. He is not what he once was. The remark does not appear in print. It is not issued as formal criticism. It lives in drawing rooms between the soft touch of porcelain and silver, in half-whispered conversations across Vienna in the late 1780s. No one declares that Mozart is finished, but his name is spoken more quietly. In 1788, Vienna no longer pulses with the dense concert seasons of a few years earlier. War with the Ottoman Empire strains the Habsburg treasury. The aristocracy tightens its spending. Lavish entertainments are no longer so easily financed. Music still exists, Money does not flow as freely. Mozart remains in Vienna. He continues to compose, to teach. But the rhythm shifts. The subscription concerts he once organized grow less regular. The number of pupils declines. Letters requesting loans appear more frequently, not collapse. Fluctuation. In this climate, in 1788, Mozart writes his final 3 symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41. There is no firm evidence that they are widely performed at once. No surviving advertisement announces a grand premiere. They may have been intended for a series of concerts that never fully materializes. 3 monumental works, written in relative quiet. The paradox is striking. Symphony number 39 opens with a dignity that feels almost purely classical. Number 40 moves into another space, darker, more restless, its urgent pulse and shifting harmonies refusing complete ease. Number 41, later called Jupiter, closes with a finale so intricate it seems nearly defiant. Mozart does not write like a man retreating. He writes like someone who still believes in structure. Even as his outer life loses stability, his music constructs architectures of remarkable strength. But architecture does not pay the rent. There are months when the Mozart family moves to smaller quarters on the edge of Vienna to save money. Letters to friends requesting financial help are not dramatic lamentations. They are practical, specific, with promises of repayment on a set date. Mozart is not destitute in the absolute sense, nor is he as comfortable as he once was. He lives between shores. Vienna itself is changing. Not because Mozart's music has grown obsolete, but because the patronage structures surrounding him are no longer secure. Private concerts become less frequent. The nobility grows cautious. When the economy contracts, the arts are among the first to feel it. Younger musicians begin to appear, not as direct adversaries, but as fresh currents. Mozart, in his early 30s, is not old, but he is no longer the novelty. There is a subtle difference between being respected and being sought after. Mozart is still respected, but the audience's eagerness is no longer what it once was. One winter evening, he sits at the keyboard in a smaller room, listening to the wind slip through the narrow seams of the door. Candle wax burns slowly. Constanze rests in the next room, her health not always steady. The children who survive need care. He begins to play a theme, not to perform, simply to hear it. Music now is no longer a stage light. It is private dialogue. Fragile success is not failure. It is the sensation that the ground beneath one's feet is less firm than before. Mozart does not stop working. He accepts smaller commissions, writes for particular occasions, composes for church, for stage, for friends. He does not withdraw, but he adapts. What makes this period remarkable is not deprivation. It is duality. On one side, financial instability. On the other hand, deepening music. Symphony number 40 is not the work of a carefree mind. Within it lives a tension that does not erupt, but smolders. Not despair yet, not serenity. Mozart keeps no diary of anxiety. He writes in sound. In these years, he is no longer the exhilarated independent artist of 1784. He is a man of 32-33, standing between family and market, between faith in his talent and the hard edges of economic reality. Fame does not vanish, it recedes. Like water pulling back from shore, exposing sand never before seen. What stands out is this: Mozart does not return to the old patronage system. He does not seek a court position again in Salzburg. He does not search for a new master to guarantee a monthly salary. He remains in Vienna. He remains with the model he chose. He remains with the risks he has chosen. Perhaps he believes the cycle will turn again. Perhaps there is simply no other path left. Yet, in the quiet of smaller rooms, amid letters requesting loans and symphonies uncertain to be performed, one thing does not change. He continues to write on a grand scale. He does not shrink his ambition. He does not simplify his architecture. That fact speaks clearly. When a person begins to doubt himself, the work often grows smaller. Mozart does not. His final 3 symphonies stand like cathedrals rising in a city that lacks the funds to build them. Beautiful, balanced, and not necessarily understood at once. Fragile success is not a breaking sound. It is a crack. And even a small crack alters the way a man listens to himself. Mozart enters 1790 with less glitter but not less music. He does not yet know that only 1 year remains. 1 year to write his final works. 1 year for light and shadow to merge. And when the light returns once more, it will not look the same. Chapter 13. The Requiem and the Man in Grey. The final mystery of Mozart. One afternoon in July 1791, as the sunlight of Vienna slants through the window of a modest apartment, there is a knock at the door. Not urgent, not forceful, just enough to make the person inside look up. A well-dressed man stands at the threshold. Gray cloak, a face that leaves no strong impression. His voice is courteous yet distant. He does not give his name. He has come to commission a mass for the dead, a requiem. In Constanze's recollections, many years later, the messenger is remembered by that gray cloak, a detail perhaps deepened by memory and time. Mozart accepts. In that era, anonymous commissions are not unusual. Nobles often hire composers through intermediaries. The man in gray represents Count Franz von Walsegg, who has a habit of commissioning works and presenting them as his own. Mozart does not know who truly stands behind the request. He knows only this: it is a mass for the departed, and the payment is needed. The year 1791 is not entirely shadowed. On the contrary, it begins with promising signs. Mozart is commissioned to write a new opera for Prague. He receives a request for a German singspiel that will become the Magic Flute. He composes the Clarinet Concerto, one of the most luminous works of his career. There is work. Money is not always sufficient. But the music surges again. And amid all of this, the Requiem lies quietly on the desk. According to Constanze's later account, Mozart grows uneasy, saying he feels as though he is writing the Mass for himself. Whether this is true foreboding or memory searching for meaning after an early death, we cannot know. The reality is more complex. Later family recollections mention his fear of being poisoned. Yet no medical evidence confirms such suspicion. The fevers, the swelling, the exhaustion may well arise from natural illness rather than conspiracy. The 19th century will hunger for drama. Mozart's century does not. What we do know is that he works intensely. Opera by day, Requiem by night, two parallel worlds. On one side, the Magic Flute filled with light symbols, faith in reason and brotherhood. On the other, a darker mass of sound opening with somber chords. Introitus, Requiem aeternum. There is something different in the Requiem, not because it is his last work, but because it does not reach toward the stage. It does not seek laughter or applause. It reaches toward permanence. Mozart is no longer writing for the drawing rooms of Vienna. He writes for a rite dedicated to the dead. In the final weeks of 1791, his health fluctuates. He continues to work. He conducts the premiere of the Magic Flute in September. He completes the clarinet concerto for Anton Stadler. He accepts other commissions. But the Requiem begins to claim more of his time and more of his mind. Not because he is certain death is near, but because the ritual itself forces the composer to face the final question. What is a human being when all sound comes to an end? There is an image often retold. Mozart lies in bed weakened, yet still singing the choral parts aloud so that his students can copy them down. When they reach the Lacrimosa, he is said to grow so moved that he cannot continue. We cannot measure the accuracy of every detail, but we know this. He does not complete the work. The Lacrimosa stops after 8 measures. Then there is space, not because he has no more ideas, but because his body cannot keep pace. The Requiem is not merely a mass for the dead. It stands at the intersection of 3 forces: financial necessity, professional obligation, and the increasingly tangible presence of death. The man in gray departs after placing the commission, but his outline remains, not as a supernatural figure, but as a reminder that every work carries a deadline. And this time the deadline is not only the delivery of a manuscript. The year 1791 finds Mozart writing with a velocity that suggests time is narrowing. The Magic Flute succeeds in Vienna, drawing common audiences and intellectual circles alike. The opera overflows with Enlightenment symbolism, with trials and light at the end of darkness. There is an irony here. While composing a work about passing through shadow toward illumination, he writes in parallel music for the dead. Light and darkness no longer stand apart, as they did in Figaro and Don Giovanni. They merge. Mozart at this moment is not a forgotten genius, nor is he the blazing star of 1784. He is a 35-year-old man working to exhaustion, poised between renewed hope and failing health. The question is not whether he knows he is about to die. The question is what he hears while writing the Requiem. The sound of faith, the sound of duty, or the sound of silence approaching. The man in gray may have been nothing more than an ordinary messenger for a count who preferred anonymity. Yet in the story of Mozart, he becomes a symbol of a limit. And when that limit arrives, the score remains unfinished on the desk. Does Mozart know he is about to leave? Or is he simply doing what he has done all his life, writing as if music will always grant him one more day? Chapter 14. The Unfinished Requiem. Who completed Mozart's final work? It is not death that ends the Requiem. It is the silence after the eighth measure. Lacrimosa dies illa. The choral line rises, then falls like a restrained sigh. Mozart writes through the eighth bar. There the manuscript stops. The ink has barely dried. The notes remain clear on the page. And then nothing. No triumphant close. No final chord. Only a break in the line. After December 5th, 1791, the small room no longer carries his voice. Yet the manuscript still rests on the desk. And there is a practical matter, a contract. Count Franz von Walsegg has paid part of the fee in advance. The remainder will come only when the Requiem is delivered complete. Constanze understands this. The family is not in a position to refuse. The Requiem cannot remain at 8 measures. At first, Constanze turns to musicians who might help finish the work from what Mozart has left behind. For a time, she approaches Joseph Eibler, a respected colleague. He attempts to continue portions of the score from the manuscript, but does not carry the task to completion. Eventually, Franz Xaver Süssmayr accepts the responsibility. Süssmayr is not a genius in the way his teacher was, but he is close to Mozart in those final months. He knows the style, and more importantly, he is willing. Which parts of the Requiem belong to Mozart, which belong to Süssmayr? The question has followed this work for more than 2 centuries. What we know with relative certainty is this. Mozart completes the entire introitus and the Kyrie. He leaves the vocal lines and continuo bass along with a clear harmonic framework for much of the sequence. In several of these movements, later hands complete the orchestration. The Lacrimosa stops at the 8th measure. From that point onward, Süssmayr completes the work drawing on sketches on verbal instructions he is said to have received, and in some sections composing anew. Sanctus, Benedictus, Agnus Dei. These movements are largely Süssmayr's contribution, though the Agnus Dei recalls thematic material from the opening introitus. What is striking is this. For many listeners today, the boundary is not immediately audible. The music feels continuous. The emotional arc remains intact. Perhaps because Süssmayr understands his teacher's language. Perhaps because Mozart lays a foundation so strong that it guides the rest. When the completed Requiem is delivered to Walsegg, it is presented as a work of Mozart. In that context, the line between art contract and survival is not cleanly drawn. The decision is both practical and necessary. Walsegg later arranges a performance under his own name, as is his habit. But truth does not remain still. Copies circulate. The musical world knows, and gradually the Requiem binds itself inseparably to the name Mozart. The unfinished music becomes a symbol, not because it is perfect, but because it is incomplete. There is something about a genius leaving a work undone that draws later generations closer. Had the Requiem closed in full under Mozart's own hand, it might have stood as simply another summit among many summits. But because it breaks mid-sentence, it carries a question. What might he have done with more time? Susmer completes the Requiem not only with technique, but in the shadow of a man newly gone. The pressure is immense. Every added chord risks comparison with what might have been. Today we have multiple versions of the Requiem. Some scholars attempt reconstructions based on stylistic analysis. Some conductors choose to retain Susmayer's completion, honoring the first version that entered wide circulation. The Requiem is not a single block of stone. It is a layered sediment. Mozart forms the foundation. Susmayer stands above. Between them lies the silence of that December. There is an irony here. Mozart, who spent his life seeking freedom from systems of patronage, ultimately leaves behind a work that must be finished because of a contract. Payment signature's obligation. These ordinary matters stand between art and death. The Requiem, therefore, is more than music. It is a story of continuation. Genius does not always close its own circle. Sometimes another hand must close it. That does not diminish the work. If we listen closely, we still hear Mozart clearly in the Kyrie, in the dense fugues, in the Confutatis, with its stark contrast between flame and prayer. And even in the section Susmer completes, Mozart's presence lingers like light filtering through different stained glass. An unfinished work is not a failure. It is a reminder that art never belongs entirely to one person. The completed Requiem is performed. Listeners are moved. Not all can discern the boundary between two hands. Perhaps that boundary does not matter. What matters is that the music continues. From the small room where the final breath fades to church, to the theater, to concert halls of centuries yet to come. Mozart does not sign the final chord, yet the sound carries his name. And the lingering question is not who wrote which measure. It is this. If even genius must stop mid-phrase, what within us is capable of continuing? Chapter 15. The Myth of Mozart's Death. Truth and Embellished Tales. St. Mark's Cemetery today is quiet. There is no open common grave, no hurried snow covering fresh earth, only narrow paths, evenly grown grass, and a memorial stone placed symbolically. Visitors arrive, take photographs, stand in silence for a few moments, then move on. Mozart's exact burial place can no longer be identified, and it is precisely that absence that gives birth to legend. In the days immediately following his death, he is not instantly elevated into a superhuman icon. His name remains respected within musical circles. His works continue to be performed. But the image of the abandoned genius does not appear at once. Legend requires time. In the early 19th century, Europe enters the Romantic era. Genius begins to be seen as solitary, misunderstood, and wounded by society. A young death becomes a mark of destiny. The artist is no longer merely a servant of the court or the church. He becomes a symbol of inner depth. Mozart, dead at 35, leaving behind an unfinished Requiem, becomes perfect material. Details that are ordinary in the context of 1791 slowly shift in meaning. His burial under the reforms of Emperor Joseph II, a regulation widely applied to the middle class, is retold as proof of extreme poverty. The absence of an individual grave marker becomes an image of abandonment. The facts are simple. Memory is not. By the mid-19th century, the poisoning story spread more widely. Antonio Salieri, a successful and well-regarded composer of the time, gradually assumes the role of antagonist in the public imagination. There is no solid evidence that he poisoned Mozart. Yet in the logic of romantic tragedy, genius requires a jealous rival. Society struggles to accept that someone like Mozart might die of an ordinary illness. It wants a climax. Literature and theater reinforce the image. Plays, novels, and later films deepen the portrait of a fragile genius misunderstood by the world, driven into shadow by intrigue. Salieri becomes a convenient silhouette. The truth is more complex. Salieri holds an esteemed position and teaches important students. He and Mozart share professional rivalry, but there is no evidence of mortal hatred. In the romantic narrative, however, rivalry is insufficient. There must be envy. There must be guilt. Legend is not built from archival documents. It is built on emotional need. The 19th century needs to believe that genius always pays a price. It needs to believe that society rarely recognizes greatness in its own time. Mozart becomes the perfect illustration. A young genius, an unfinished score, an unmarked grave. These three images fuse into a symbol. Yet if we peel away each layer, another story begins to appear. Mozart is not starving in the streets. He does not die in complete isolation. Friends, students, and family are near him. He is buried according to common regulations of his time. He is not cast out by society. What makes him extraordinary is not the circumstance of his death. It is the music that remains. And yet legend holds its own power. It draws attention. It pulls in readers, listeners, and audiences. At times it even opens the door to rediscovery. St. Mark's becomes a destination not because the exact spot of his grave is known, but because people wish to stand near a symbol. The memorial stone placed there later does not mark a precise archaeological truth. It marks a need to remember. History and memory are not identical. They intersect, overlap, then part. In the centuries after his death, Mozart lives a second life. Not the life of a composer within a patronage system, Not the life of a husband worrying over bills, but the life of a pure genius, almost superhuman. The question is not whether the myth is true or false. The question is why we need it. Perhaps because the ordinary death of an extraordinary man unsettles us. It reminds us that talent does not shield the body, that inspiration does not halt illness, that genius still submits to biology. Myth softens that discomfort. It gives death a larger meaning. It turns disease into a conspiracy, turns social circumstance into tragedy, turns gaps in documentation into space for imagination. Yet when the layers of legend are peeled away, what remains does not diminish. Mozart still writes Figaro, still writes Don Giovanni, still leaves behind the Requiem. The music does not require added drama to endure. We retell the story of his death in ways that reflect our own era. The Romantic century needs a betrayed genius. The 20th century needs a tragic figure for stage and film. The 21st century turns back to documents, analyzes records, and strips away embellishment. Each age rewrites the final chapter according to its own need. But beneath the retellings, a simple truth stands. A 35-year-old man dies of illness. His music does not. And perhaps the most revealing question is not where he is buried, but why more than 2 centuries later do we continue to return to the story, to revise it, to argue over it, and to search within it for a reflection of ourselves. Chapter 16. Beethoven and Mozart. Did a fateful meeting truly happen? Vienna, an afternoon in 1787. A young man from Bonn enters the city with dust still clinging to his shoes from the long road. He is not a nobleman. He owns no private carriage. He does not carry the continental fame that Mozart once held as a prodigy. His name is Ludwig van Beethoven. The story goes that Beethoven is brought to meet Mozart, that he sits at the keyboard, that Mozart listens with indifference at first, then after hearing him improvise, turns to someone nearby and says, "Keep your eye on him. One day he will make the world speak of him." We have no firm evidence that those words are ever spoken. They may be memory shaped by hindsight. But Beethoven does travel to Vienna in 1787. And he does long to study with Mozart. If a meeting occurs, it is brief. News of his mother's grave illness forces him to return to Bonn. He does not remain long. When Beethoven comes back to Vienna in 1792, Mozart is gone. The room is open. But the keeper of the key has left. Vienna remains the musical center, yet the axis has shifted. The classical generation, Haydn and Mozart, has defined the structure. Beethoven does not arrive to serve that structure. He arrives to test its limits. Mozart writes symphonies like balanced architecture. Beethoven writes symphonies like seismic events. The contrast does not diminish Mozart. It reveals a century in motion. Beethoven studies with Joseph Haydn. Yet Mozart's shadow lingers. In Beethoven's early piano concertos, one hears Mozart's language clearly. The transparency, the dialogue between soloist and orchestra. The elegance of proportion. Beethoven does not reject Mozart. He continues from him. There is something subtle here. Mozart never fully lives inside the Romantic age. He stands at its threshold. His music is rich with feeling, yet it preserves the formal clarity of the classical world. Beethoven crosses that threshold. If Mozart is light within a perfectly proportioned room, Beethoven is the window thrown open. But to open a window, the room must first exist. In the early years of the 19th century, Mozart's works continue to be performed. Not all are instantly embraced. Yet gradually he becomes a standard. Young composers learn fugue from the Requiem, learn opera from Figaro, learn symphonic balance from the Jupiter Symphony. Mozart does not live to see this. Beethoven does. He lives long enough to feel himself become central, long enough to hear praise and resistance, long enough to lose his hearing and wrestle with silence. Mozart has no such span. He does not grow old. He does not test longer forms. He does not break himself apart and rebuild. When Beethoven writes the Third Symphony, the Eroica, he expands the scale and ambition of the genre beyond anything heard before. When he composes the Fifth and the Ninth, he turns the symphony into a personal declaration. Might Mozart have done something similar? We do not know. But we know this. Beethoven does not compose in a void. He writes upon a foundation already laid. On certain evenings in the early 19th century, when one of Mozart's symphonies is performed in Vienna, Beethoven may sit somewhere in the hall, not as a direct pupil, but as an heir. Not every influence requires declaration. It lives in the handling of a chord, in the shaping of a theme, in the respect for form before daring to fracture it. Mozart becomes a quiet standard. And that is another form of immortality, not a monument of stone, not a tale of poison, but a presence woven into the architecture of those who follow. Beethoven does not replace Mozart. He does what every powerful generation does. He opens the room wider. Yet if we step back, we see two figures within that space. One dies at 35. One lives long enough to hear applause and argument alike. Between them, there is no duel. There is a continuation. Mozart does not grow old, but his music ages alongside Europe. And when Beethoven places his hands upon the keys, whether he knows it or not, part of that room has already been built. Built from luminous, balanced harmonies and from a belief that music can be both ordered and deeply human. The room stands open. A new generation enters. And the name Mozart no longer lies beneath snow. It resounds in the hands of another. Chapter 17. The Mozart Effect. Does his music truly make us smarter? Why can a piece of music soothe a newborn child? Why do melodies written more than 2 centuries ago still echo in clinics, in classrooms, in the headphones of people who have never read a single line of notation? There was a time when people believed Mozart spoke with angels. By the late 20th century, some began to say he spoke with the brain. In 1993, a small study published in Nature reported that college students who listened to a Mozart sonata for several minutes performed slightly better on a spatial reasoning task than those who sat in silence. The effect was brief. The headlines were not. Listening to Mozart makes you smarter. The phrase spread faster than any fugue. Compact discs appeared under the label Mozart Effect. Parents played his music to unborn children. Some American states even distributed Mozart recordings to families with newborns. Music became a tool for intellectual development. Mozart once again was mythologized, this time through science. The truth, however, is more nuanced. The original study did not claim that listening to Mozart permanently raised IQ. It observed a short-lived improvement in one type of spatial task. Subsequent research attempted to replicate the findings. Some studies found modest temporary effects. Others did not. Gradually, the scientific community reached a more measured view. If a so-called Mozart effect exists, it likely reflects temporary arousal and alertness rather than neurological magic. In other words, it may not be Mozart in particular that makes one sharper. It may be music one enjoys that heightens attention for a moment. Yet Mozart is often chosen for such experiments. Perhaps because his musical language is balanced. Rhythms are clear. Themes converse in ordered patterns. The human brain is drawn to structure. It searches for a pattern. Mozart offers that pattern in a form that feels accessible. When we listen to one of his concertos, the brain does not merely process sound. It anticipates. It waits for the return of a theme. It recognizes variation. Regions linked to emotion, memory, and movement activate together. Music does not pass only through the ear. It moves through the entire body. Today, Mozart's works appear in varied settings. Played before surgery to ease anxiety. Used as background in classrooms, even incorporated into certain therapeutic approaches for epilepsy. The results are not miraculous. Yet evidence suggests that music can influence heart rate, stress levels, and emotional state. Mozart is not a neuroscientist. He does not write the Kyrie to optimize alpha waves. But his music, poised between clarity and complexity, seems to touch something fundamental in how we process sound. Perhaps because he understands structure intuitively. A passage of Mozart rarely overwhelms. It allows the listener to follow. Even at its most intricate, it remains transparent. Like a room filled with enough light to reveal every detail, yet never so bright that it blinds. The brain prefers light of that kind. If we set aside the headlines and look more closely, the more compelling question is not whether Mozart makes us smarter. It is why we want to believe that he does. Perhaps because it gives art a measurable value. If music raises scores, it is worth funding. If it improves performance, it is useful. In a world that reveres data, we search for proof that beauty yields results. Yet Mozart's value does not reside in test scores. It resides in his ability to make us pause. When a child listens to Eine kleine Nachtmusik and gently sways to its pulse, what happens is not an increase in IQ. It is a connection. When a patient waits in a quiet room and a piano concerto slows the rhythm of the heart, it is not a miracle. It is a physiological response to order and cadence. Music does not turn us into geniuses. It reminds us that we can feel. Across the 2 centuries after his death, Mozart has traveled from aristocratic salons to laboratories, from theater stages to brain imaging scanners, from handwritten scores to digital files streaming through headphones. Each era explains him in its own language. The 19th century speaks of the soul. The 20th speaks of genius. The 21st speaks of synapses and neural waves. Perhaps each touches part of the truth. Mozart's music does not permanently reshape the brain after a few minutes of listening, but it reveals what the brain longs for: pattern, balance, a measure of surprise. And within that balance, we find a moment of quiet. Not because he is more intelligent than we are, but because he helps us hear ourselves more clearly. The brain analyzes, the heart responds, and between those 2 movements, Mozart continues to sound. Chapter 18. Genius, or a child who never grew up. The real Mozart. There is a letter that unsettles many readers. In it, Mozart indulges in crude jokes, wordplay about bodily functions and laughter that sounds more like a 12-year-old boy than a 30-year-old composer. The language is not a single slip. It appears again and again in letters to his sister and to Constanze. The genius of Requiem. The author of Don Giovanni. The man who wrote harmonies so refined they seem almost transparent. And also the man who laughs at jokes that are decidedly earthy. It makes us uncomfortable. We want genius to be solemn. We want the composer of a mass for the dead to speak like a saint. But Mozart does not. He delights in puns, in mischief, in making others laugh. His letters overflow with energy, rhythm, and at times deliberate childishness. Some scholars describe it as scatological humor comedy revolving around bodily matters usually deemed indecorous. Why? There are many theories. Some suggest it was simply family culture. His mother and sister used similar jokes. In a private context, it may not have been as unusual as modern readers imagine. The 18th century was not always as solemn as oil portraits make it appear. Others search for deeper psychological explanations. That a child raised amid court etiquette, beaux ceremony, constant scrutiny might seek release by laughing at what is lowest. That is when one's childhood requires adult composure. The child within looks for moments to resurface. Perhaps. But we do not need to turn every laugh into a symptom. Mozart can be profound and mischievous at once. In performance, he can be so focused that a hall holds its breath. Off stage, he can leap about the room, imitate a cat, tease friends until they shake their heads in equal parts affection and exasperation. Leopold sees these 2 versions early on: the restless child and the artist of total concentration. They do not cancel each other out. They complete each other. There is something striking here in Mozart's music. We hear the same duality. Figaro is comic, yet touches social structure. Don Giovanni contains playful chases and ends in hellfire. Even in the Requiem, amid the weight of its chords, moments rise with unexpected lightness. He does not divide the world into high and low. He lets them coexist. So when we read those letters full of laughter, we should not rush to conclude that the genius was immature. Perhaps it is precisely the preserved childlike curiosity that allows him to approach music without exhaustion. Someone overly severe with himself may lose flexibility. Mozart does not lose it. Yet that youthful spirit has its shadow. He is not a cautious manager of money. He enjoys a lively life. He enjoys billiards, company, evenings filled with laughter. When money arrives, he spends in the rhythm of exhilaration. When it slows, pressure gathers. Some call it immaturity. Others call it artistic temperament. Perhaps both are partly true. Mozart is not a saint. He is human, and that is what makes him closer to us than we expect. The 19th century prefers to cast him as a wounded angel. The 20th sometimes reacts by emphasizing the crude letters as if to pull the idol down. But both extremes miss something simple. A person can contain contradictions without being a contradiction. Mozart can write an adagio that moves listeners to tears, and a few hours later compose a letter full of playful, earthy jokes. That does not diminish the music. It makes the man who wrote it more real. When we listen to the 40th Symphony, we do not hear the mischievous laughter of the letters. We hear tension, inward motion. Yet perhaps it is precisely his ability to touch both poles, the solemn and the playful, that allows him to portray the human being more completely. Genius is not someone without a childlike side. A genius may be someone who does not lose it. Mozart dies at 35. We will never know what kind of 50-year-old man he might have become. Would the mischief have softened? Would the laughter have deepened? Or would it have remained merely hidden more carefully? We have only what remains: the scores, the letters, the recollections. And within them, we see a man who does not fit neatly into the frame we try to give him. Not entirely solemn, not entirely impulsive, not entirely innocent, not entirely tragic. Mozart is not an angel. He is not a perpetual child. He is a human being who lives at high intensity, high emotion, high intellect, and high laughter. Perhaps it is that very imperfection that keeps his music from turning to stone. It still breathes, like a faint echo of laughter lingering in a room after the final note has faded. And the remaining question, not about genius, but about the man, is this: if that man had been given 20 more years, what would have changed? Chapter 19. If Mozart had lived, 20 more years would music history have changed. Imagine a winter morning in 1792. Mozart does not die. The fever passes. The body remains weak, but it recovers. The Requiem is completed by his own hand. No empty space at the Lacrimosa. No pupil writing the remainder. no legend of an unfinished masterpiece. He turns 36. History bends along another branch. Vienna at the dawn of the 19th century is no longer the Vienna of 1784. The French Revolution has altered Europe. Ideas of liberty, individuality, and heroism spread across borders. Artists no longer merely serve. They begin to declare. Mozart, who once left the patronage system to live freely, might have found in this new era a more fitting atmosphere. He tasted freedom before it became a movement, but he also paid for it. If he had lived 20 more years, he would have faced something he never truly experienced: long maturity. No longer the prodigy, no longer a young phenomenon, no longer a genius who dies too soon. He would have been a middle-aged man in a changing world. Beethoven would not remain the young visitor passing briefly through Vienna. He would become a real rival. Longer symphonies, greater drama, denser textures. Audiences grow accustomed to expanded forms and personal declarations. What would Mozart have done? There are at least two possibilities. One, he might have held firmly to classical structure, refining it toward absolute purity, becoming a symbol of balance in a turbulent age. In a world growing louder, he might have been the voice of clarity. Two, he might have expanded himself. The seeds already present in Don Giovanni and the 40th Symphony might have blossomed into something closer to romanticism, deeper tragedy, broader architecture, bolder harmony. We have seen him change before. From the sonatas of youth to Figaro. From Figaro to Don Giovanni. From Don Giovanni to the Requiem. Mozart does not stand still. Why assume he would have stopped in 1791? Perhaps he would have written a 42nd symphony. Perhaps he would have experimented with larger orchestras. Perhaps he would have ventured further into German opera, widening the path that the Magic Flute had begun. But there is another possibility less often spoken of. Long life can erode certain things. The genius who dies young is preserved at the summit. No period of decline, no late controversial works, no repetition. Death frames the image. The genius who lives must endure time. The genius who dies early is protected by it. Mozart, had he lived 20 more years, might no longer have remained the fragile symbol of perfection. He might have become a more complex figure with public successes and public failures alike. Would that have diminished him or made him more real? Imagine a concert in 1805. Beethoven presents a new symphony, powerful and unsettling. In the hall sits a man whose hair has begun to gray, listening with a restrained smile. Mozart is no longer the center. He is one voice among many. Would he feel threatened, or would he be curious as he once was when absorbing Italian style, German rigor, and French elegance during his youthful travels? We know Mozart learned quickly, absorbed quickly, transformed quickly. Perhaps he would not have resisted the age, he would have conversed with it. Yet one thing is certain: if Mozart had lived 20 more years, we would not tell his story as we do now. there would be no image of the genius who dies young, no unfinished requiem as a symbol of fate, no unmarked grave to become a space for imagination to fill. Instead, we might have had an older Mozart, deeper, perhaps less translucent, but more layered. We have lost a future that never existed, and that loss creates its own gravity. When we think of Mozart, we think of unrealized possibility, of what might have been, of the symphony unwritten, the opera unstaged, the unfinished dialogue with Beethoven and with the 19th century. But perhaps the essential question is not what he would have composed. It is where we need him to stop. A Mozart who grows old would lengthen the story. A Mozart who dies at 35 makes it concentrated. The music he leaves feels complete enough to satisfy, incomplete enough to ache. And perhaps it is that absence which keeps him forever young, not in body, but in imagination. If he had lived for 20 more years, music history might indeed have been different. Yet one thing would be difficult to alter. When the lights dim in a modern hall and the opening notes of a Mozart concerto begin, listeners still feel what Vienna felt in 1784. A fragile balance between order and emotion, an open room, a sound that does not age. Mozart did not live for another 20 years, but his music did. And perhaps in this world, that is the longest life possible. And perhaps somewhere right now a hall has just gone dark. A musician lifts an instrument, and a familiar melody begins. Not to commemorate, not to mourn, simply to listen. If you have walked with me through this journey, leave a word behind, a name you would like us to enter next. For now, let the night close, and let the music continue.